There's a strange moment that can happen after decades of being the person everybody calls. The kids handle their own problems. Work doesn't need you at full capacity anymore. The emergencies slow down, and technically, this is what you wanted. More time, less pressure, freedom. So why can it feel less like freedom and more like somebody quietly removed a piece of you? Because all those responsibilities may have been doing something you couldn't see while you were busy carrying them. They weren't just giving you things to do. They were telling you who you were. And when people stop needing the role, you're left with a much harder question. How much of that role had become you? For years, maybe decades, there was rarely much mystery about what came next. Somebody needed a ride. Something at work had to be fixed. A parent needed help. A kid needed money, advice, a decision, a signature, a place to stay. There was a problem in the house, a deadline, a crisis, a person who didn't know what to do next, and somehow you became the person who did. That can be exhausting. But exhaustion and meaning are not opposites. Sometimes they're sitting in the same chair, because every time life handed you another problem, it also handed you a position. You were the parent who handled it, the employee who could be counted on, the sibling who kept things together, the one who knew who to call, the one who didn't panic, the one who showed up. You didn't have to spend much time asking, "What is my role here?" Life answered before you could, and that is the first thing that's easy to miss about being needed. It doesn't just consume time, it organizes time. It tells you where to go, what matters today, and whether you succeeded. There is a problem. You respond. The problem gets smaller. Your usefulness becomes visible. Then you do it again tomorrow. After enough years, that rhythm can become so ordinary that you stop recognizing it as a source of identity. It just feels like life, until life stops asking. And this is where the transition gets confusing. Because you may genuinely be glad the pressure is lower, you don't actually want the 6:15 phone call saying something went wrong. You don't want to start raising teenagers again. You don't want your entire week controlled by somebody else's schedule. You may have spent years imagining what it would feel like when things finally calmed down. Then they do. And instead of pure relief, there's this quiet space you weren't expecting. Nothing is necessarily wrong. That's what makes it so difficult to explain. If something terrible had happened, you'd have a reason for how you feel. But the house is fine. The kids may be doing well. Work may have become easier because you earned the right for it to become easier. You may finally have choices you didn't have 20 years ago. So complaining about it can almost feel ungrateful. This is what I wanted. Why don't I know what to do with it? But maybe the better question is not what you're supposed to do with the extra time. Maybe it's what the old demands were doing for you, because responsibility can carry a hidden bargain. It asks a lot from you, but in return it gives you constant evidence that you matter in a very specific way. Someone needs your judgment. Someone needs your experience. Someone needs you to solve something they can't solve alone. Your value gets demonstrated in real time. Then the need decreases. Your abilities haven't disappeared. Your experience hasn't disappeared. Your relationship with the people you love hasn't disappeared. But the frequency of the evidence changes, and that can feel surprisingly different. Think about how many forms of competence are easiest to feel when somebody requires them. You can know you're dependable, but it's different when nobody needs to depend on you today. You can know you give good advice, but it's different when your adult child makes the decision without asking. You can know you were good at your job, but it's different when the organization keeps moving on a Tuesday afternoon and nobody needs your answer. The ability is still there. The audience for the ability has changed, and that distinction matters. Because otherwise, it's very easy to misread what you're feeling. You can call it boredom, you can call it loneliness, you can call it getting older. You can decide you've become irrelevant, or you can assume the people around you don't value you anymore. Sometimes those things really can be part of somebody's situation, but they aren't the only explanation. A person can be loved and still no longer be needed in the same way. Those are not the same thing. In fact, one of the great successes of raising capable children is that eventually they stop requiring you for everything. One of the signs that you did your work well can be that the system works without constant intervention from you. And professionally, experience often means reaching a point where you've taught other people things you once had to carry alone. By almost every practical measure, that's success. But success can still retire an identity. That is the contradiction nobody talks about very much. Sometimes the reward for doing a role well is that the role eventually becomes smaller, and then you meet the part of yourself that was hiding behind it. This is also why the obvious solution can become a trap. If being needed made your place in the world obvious, you can start looking for ways to become necessary again without realizing that's what you're doing. You solve things before anyone asks. You take responsibility that belongs to someone else. An adult child mentions a problem, and before they've finished the sentence, you're already fixing it. Someone at work starts doing something differently, and suddenly you need to show them the old way. You fill every open space with another obligation. Not necessarily because you're controlling, not necessarily because you can't let go. Sometimes being useful simply feels more familiar than being free. A problem gives you coordinates. Freedom gives you choices. And choices ask something problems don't. They ask you what you want. That can be an oddly difficult question after decades of asking what everybody else needs. What do you want to do today? Sounds simple. But if your identity has been built mostly in response to demand, there may not be an immediate answer. No emergency is assigning the priority. No boss is providing the metric. No child is defining the problem. No family member is waiting for the solution. It's just you in a day that doesn't urgently belong to anyone. That's freedom. And yes, that can also be disorienting. But this is where the story changes because the goal is not to prove that you're still necessary. It's to separate the parts of you that were real from the conditions that kept activating them. Maybe you were the fixer because people constantly gave you things to fix. But underneath that role may be something broader. You like understanding how things work. Maybe you were the person everyone talked to because your family needed stability. But perhaps what actually belongs to you is patience, perspective, or an ability to make people feel less overwhelmed. Maybe work made you feel useful because there were visible problems with visible outcomes. That doesn't mean your job was your only source of value. It may mean that competence matters deeply to you. Those are very different conclusions. One says, I need people to have problems so I can matter. The other says, I've learned something about what makes me feel alive and engaged. Now I have to decide where that belongs next. And the second version does something the first one can't. It lets people stop needing you without requiring you to disappear. Your child can become more independent without your identity collapsing. Someone younger can take over part of your job without erasing what you built. A quiet weekend can be empty of obligation without being empty of meaning. But that requires a shift that isn't especially dramatic from the outside. You start moving from usefulness that is demanded to usefulness that is chosen. Sometimes you help, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you teach. Sometimes you're the beginner. Sometimes you're valuable because of what you know. Sometimes you're valuable in a room where nobody needs anything from you at all. That last one can take some getting used to. Because being needed is wonderfully concrete. Someone calls. You answer. Problem solved, meaning rarely arrives with that kind of notification. And maybe that's why this stage can feel so strange. The old life gave you instructions. The new one gives you authorship. Those aren't the same experience. Instructions can be exhausting, but they're clear. Authorship can be freeing, but you have to decide what belongs on the page. So if life is becoming quieter, and that quiet doesn't feel entirely like the freedom you expected, it doesn't automatically mean you want the chaos back. It may mean the chaos was carrying more than you realized. It carried obligations, but it also carried a role, a rhythm, proof of competence, a reason to be in certain places, a reliable answer to the question, what do I do now? And maybe the loss isn't, nobody needs me, so I don't matter. Maybe it's more precise than that. People don't need me in the ways that used to tell me who I was. That can hurt, but it's also a much more useful problem because you don't solve it by making yourself indispensable again. You solve it by discovering which parts of that person were yours all along. The judgment, the humor, the loyalty, the competence, the curiosity. The ability to build something, understand something, teach something, notice something, care about something. Those don't have to disappear just because the old assignments do. For decades, being needed may have answered the question for you. Now, the answer has to become more voluntary. And maybe that's what nobody tells you about freedom. Freedom isn't only what happens when fewer people need something from you. Sometimes freedom begins when being needed is no longer the only proof you have that you still matter.